1978 by Will Durant. This recording of the full-length reading of The Age of Faith was published by arrangement with Monica Ariel Mahel, trustee Ethel Durant Trust, Monica Ariel Mahel and William James Durant Easton, and was produced in 1995 by Books on Tape Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Neither this recording nor any part thereof may be reproduced or used for any purpose without prior written authority from Books on Tape Incorporated. This book is read by Alexander Adams. Book 3, Judaic Civilization, 135 to 1300. Chapter 15, The Talmud. 1. The Exiles, 135 to 565. Within Islam and Christendom, a remarkable people maintained through every adversity its own unique culture, consoled and inspired by its own creed, living by its own laws and morality, producing its own poets, scientists, scholars, and philosophers, and serving as the living carriers of fertile seeds between two hostile worlds. The rebellion of Bar Kokhba, from 132 to 135, was not the last effort of the Jews to regain for Judea the freedom that Pompey and Titus had destroyed. Under Antoninus Pius, from 138 to 161, they tried again and failed. Their holy city was forbidden them except on the bitter anniversary of its destruction, when they were allowed, for a consideration, to come and mourn by the walls of their shattered temple. In Palestine, where 985 towns had been wiped out, and 580,000 men and women had been slain, in Bar Kokhba's revolt, the Jewish population had sunk to half its former volume, and to such an abyss of poverty that cultural life was almost wholly dead. Nevertheless, within a generation after Bar Kokhba, the Beth Din, or Jewish National Council, a court of 71 rabbinical scholars and legists, was established in Tiberias. Synagogues and schools were opened, and hope rose again. The triumph of Christianity brought new difficulties. Before his conversion, Constantine had placed the religion of the Jews on a footing of legal equality with those of his other subjects. After his conversion, the Jews were oppressed with new restrictions and exactions, and Christians were forbidden to associate with them. Constantius banished the rabbis in 337, and made the marriage of a Jew with a Christian woman a capital crime. Julian's brother Gallus taxed the Jews so heavily that many of them sold their children to meet his demands. In 352 they rebelled again, and were again suppressed. Sepphoris was razed to the ground, Tiberias and other cities were partly destroyed, thousands of Jews were killed, thousands were enslaved. The condition of the Palestinian Jews now, in 359, sank so low, and their communication with other Jewish communities was so difficult that their patriarch, Hillel I, resigned their right to determine for all Jews the dates of the Jewish festivals, and issued for the independent computation of these dates a calendar that remains in use among the Jews of the world to this day. From these afflictions the Jews were saved for a moment by the accession of Julian. He reduced their taxes, revoked discriminatory laws, lauded Hebrew charity, and acknowledged Yahweh as a great God. He asked Jewish leaders why they had abandoned animal sacrifice. When they replied that their law did not permit this except in the temple at Jerusalem, he ordered that the temple should be rebuilt with state funds. Jerusalem was again opened to the Jews. They flocked to it from every quarter of Palestine, from every province of the empire. Men, women, and children gave their labor to the rebuilding, their savings and jewelry to the furnishing of the new temple. We can imagine the happiness of a people that for 3 centuries had prayed for this day, this occurring in 361. But as the foundations were being dug, flames burst from the ground and burnt several workmen to death. The work was patiently resumed, but a repetition of the phenomenon, presumably due to the explosion of natural gas, interrupted and discouraged the enterprise. The Christians rejoiced at what seemed a divine prohibition. The Jews marveled and mourned. Then came Julian's sudden death. State funds were withdrawn, the old restrictive laws were reenacted and made more severe, and the Jews, again excluded from Jerusalem, returned to their villages, their poverty, and their prayers. Soon thereafter, Jerome reported the Jewish population of Palestine as but a 10th part of their previous multitude. In 425, Theodosius II abolished the Palestinian Patriarchate. Greek Christian churches replaced the synagogues and schools, and after a brief outburst in 614, Palestine surrendered its leadership of the Jewish world. The Jews could hardly be blamed if they hoped to fare better in less Christian lands. Some moved east into Mesopotamia and Persia, and reinvigorated that Babylonian Jewry which had never ceased since the captivity of 597 BC. In Persia, too, the Jews were excluded from state office, but as all Persians except the nobility were likewise excluded, there was less offense in the restriction. And there were several persecutions of Jews in Persia, but taxation was less severe, the government was normally cooperative, and the exilarch, or head of the Jewish community, was recognized and honored by the Persian kings. The soil of Iraq was then irrigated and fertile. The Jews there became prosperous farmers as well as clever traders. Some, including famous scholars, grew rich by brewing beer. The Jewish communities in Persia multiplied rapidly, for Persian law permitted, and the Jews practiced, polygamy, for reasons that we have seen under Mohammedan law. The good rabbis Rab and Nachman, when traveling, were accustomed to advertise in each city for temporary wives, to give local youth an exemplar of matrimonial as against a promiscuous life. In Nahardia, Surah, and Pumbeditha, schools of higher education rose, whose scholarship and rabbinical decisions were honored throughout the dispersion. Meanwhile, the dispersion of the Jews continued through all the Mediterranean lands. Some went to join old Jewish communities in Syria and Asia Minor. Some went to Constantinople despite the hostility of Greek emperors and patriarchs. Some turned south from Palestine into Arabia, dwelt in peace and religious freedom with their Arab fellow Semites, occupied whole regions like Khyber, almost equaled the Arabs in Yathrib, or Medina, made many converts, and prepared the Arab mind for the Judaism of the Quran. Some crossed the Red Sea into Abyssinia and multiplied so rapidly there that in 315 they were reputed to be half the population. Jews controlled half the shipping of Alexandria, and their prosperity in that excitable city fed the flames of religious animosity. Jewish communities developed in all the North African cities, and in Sicily and Sardinia. In Italy they were numerous, and though occasionally harassed by the Christian population, they were for the most part protected by pagan emperors, Christian emperors, Theodoric, and the popes. In Spain there had been Jewish settlements before Caesar, and they had developed there without molestation under the pagan empire. They prospered under the Arian Visigoths, but suffered disheartening persecutions after King Recared, from 586 to 601, adopted the Nicene Creed. We hear of no persecution of Jews in Gaul until the severe enactments of the Third and Fourth Councils of Orleans in 538 and 541, a generation after the conquest of Arian Visigothic Gaul by the Orthodox Christian Clovis. About 560, the Christians of Orleans burned down a synagogue. The Jews petitioned Guthrum, king of the Franks, to rebuild it at public cost, as Theodoric in like case had done. Guthrum refused. "O King glorious for wonderful wisdom," exclaimed Bishop Gregory of Tours. From such tribulations the Jews of the dispersion always recovered. Patiently they rebuilt their synagogues and their lives, toiled, traded, lent money, prayed and hoped, increased and multiplied. Each settlement was required to maintain at communal expense at least one elementary and one secondary school, both of them usually in the synagogue. Scholars were advised not to live in any town that lacked such schools. The language of worship and instruction was Hebrew. The language of daily speech was Aramaic in the East, Greek in Egypt and Eastern Europe. Elsewhere, the Jews adopted the language of the surrounding population. The central theme of Jewish education was religion. Secular culture was now almost ignored. Dispersed Jewry could maintain itself in body and soul only through the law, and religion was the study and observance of the law. The faith of their fathers became more precious to the Jews the more it was attacked, and the Talmud and the synagogue were the indispensable support and refuge of an oppressed and bewildered people whose life rested on hope, and their hope on faith in their God. 2. The makers of the Talmud. In the temple, the synagogues, and the schools of Palestine and Babylonia, the scribes and the rabbis composed those enormous bodies of law and commentary known as the Palestinian and Babylonian Talmuds. Moses, they held, had left to his people not only a written law in the Pentateuch, but also an oral law which had been handed down and expanded from teacher to pupil, from generation to generation. It had been the main point of issue between the Pharisees and the Sadducees of Palestine whether this oral law was also of divine origin and binding force. As the Sadducees disappeared after the dispersion of AD 70, and the rabbis inherited the tradition of the Pharisees, The oral law was accepted by all Orthodox Jews as God's commandment, and was added to the Pentateuch to constitute the Torah, or law, by which they lived, and in which quite literally they had their being. The 1,000-year-long process by which the oral law was built up, given form, and put into writing as the Mishnah, the 8 centuries of debate, judgment, and elucidation that accumulated the 2 Gemaras as commentaries on the Mishnah, the union of the Mishnah with the shorter of these Gemaras to make the Palestinian, and with the longer to make the Babylonian, Talmud. This is one of the most complex and astonishing stories in the history of the human mind. The Bible was the literature and religion of the ancient Hebrews. The Torah was the life and blood of the medieval Jews. Because the law of the Pentateuch was written, it could not meet all the needs and circumstances of a Jerusalem without freedom, or a Judaism without Jerusalem, or a Jewry without Palestine. It was the function of the Sanhedrin teachers before the dispersion, and of the rabbis after it, to interpret the legislation of Moses for the use and guidance of a new age or place. Their interpretations and discussions, with majority and minority opinions, were transmitted from one generation of teachers to another. Perhaps to keep this oral tradition flexible, possibly to compel its memorizing, it was not written down. The rabbis who expounded the law might on occasion call in the help of persons who had accomplished the feat of committing it to memory. In the first 6 generations after Christ, the rabbis were called Tanaim, teachers of the oral law. As the sole experts in the law, they were at once the teachers and the judges of their communities in Palestine after the fall of the Temple. The rabbis of Palestine and of the dispersion constituted the most unique aristocracy in history. They were no closed or hereditary class. Many of them rose from the poorest ranks. Most of them earned their living as artisans, even after achieving international repute. And until near the end of this period they received no payment for their work as teachers and judges. Rich men sometimes made them silent partners in business enterprises, or took them into their homes, or married their daughters to them to free them from toil. A few of them were spoiled by the high status accorded to them in their communities. Some were humanly capable of anger, jealousy, hatred, undue censoriousness, pride. They had frequently to remind themselves that the true scholar is a modest man, if only because wisdom sees the part in the light of the whole. The people loved them for their virtues and their faults, admired them for their learning and their devotion, and told 1,000 stories about their judgments and their miracles. To this day no people so honors the student and the scholar as do the Jews. As rabbinical decisions accumulated, the task of memorizing them became unreasonable. Hillel, Akiva, and Meir attempted various classifications and mnemonic devices, but none of these received general acceptance. Disorder in the transmission of the law became the order of the day. The number of men who knew the entire oral law by heart was dangerously reduced, and dispersion was scattering those few to distant lands. About the year 189, at Sepphoris in Palestine, Rabbi Jehuda Hanassi took over and transformed the work of Akiva and Meir, rearranged the whole oral law, and wrote it down, with some personal additions, as the Mishnah of Rabbi Jehuda. It was so widely read that it became in time the Mishnah, the authoritative form of the oral law of the Jews. As we have it, the Mishnah, that is, oral teaching, is the result of much editing and interpolation since Jehuda. Even so, it is a compact summary, designed for memorizing by repetition, and therefore tantalizingly terse and obscure to one who comes to it from any background except that of Jewish life and history. Babylonian and European as well as Palestinian Jews accepted it, but each school placed upon its maxims an individual interpretation. As 6 generations, from AD 10 to 220, of rabbinical Tanaim had shared in formulating the Mishnah, so now 6 generations, from 220 to 500, of rabbinical Amoraim, or expounders, accumulated those 2 masses of commentary, the Palestinian and the Babylonian Gemaras. The new teachers did to the Mishnah of Jehuda what the Tanaim had done to the Old Testament. They debated, analyzed, explained, amended, and illustrated the text to apply it to the new problems and circumstances of their place and time. Towards the end of the 4th century, the schools of Palestine coordinated their commentaries in the form known as the Palestinian Gemara. About the same time, 397, Rabashi, head of the Surah College, began to codify the Babylonian Gemara and worked on it for a generation. 100 years later, in 499, Rabbina II Bar Samuel, also at Surah, brought this work to completion. If we note that the Babylonian Gemara is 11 times as long as the Mishnah, we shall begin to understand why its compilation spanned a century. Through an additional 150 years, from 500 to 650, rabbinical saboraim, or reasoners, revised this vast commentary and gave the finishing touches to the Babylonian Talmud. The word Talmud means teaching. Among the Amoraim, it was applied only to the Mishnah. In modern usage, it includes both the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Mishnah is the same in both the Palestinian and the Babylonian Talmuds. The two differ only in the Gemara or commentary, which is 4 times longer in the Babylonian than in the Palestinian form. The language of the two Gemaras is Aramaic. That of the Mishnah is Neo-Hebraic, with many borrowings from neighbor languages. The Mishnah is concise, stating a law in a few lines. The Gemaras are deliberately discursive, giving the diverse opinions of leading rabbis on the Mishnah text, describing the circumstances that might require modification of the law, and adding illustrative material. The Mishnah is mostly halakha, law. The Gemaras are partly halakha, restating or discussing a law, and partly haggadah, or story. Haggadah has been lazily defined as anything in the Talmud that is not halakha. For the most part, Haggadah includes illustrative anecdotes or examples, bits of biography, history, medicine, astronomy, astrology, magic, and theosophy, and exhortations to virtue and obedience to the law. Often, a Haggadah relieved the minds of the students after some complex and tiring debate. So, we read, Rab Ami and Rab Asi were conversing with Rabbi Isaac Napka, when one of them said to him, "Tell us, sir, some pretty legend." And the other said, "Pray explain to us rather some nice point of law." When he began the legend, he displeased the one, and when he began to explain a point of law, he offended the other. Whereupon he took up this parable. I am like the man with the 2 wives, the one young and the other old. The young one plucked out all his gray hairs that he might look young. The old wife pulled out all his black hairs that he might look old. And so between the two he became bald. So it is with me between you. 3. The Law. If now, with offensive brevity and ecumenical ignorance, we attempt to sketch some phases of this immense Talmud that entered into every cranny of medieval Hebrew life, let us confess that we are but scratching a mountain, and that our external approach condemns us to error. 1. Theology. First, said the rabbis, one must study the law, written and oral. Greater is study of Torah than the rebuilding of the temple. Every day when a man busies himself with the study of the law, he should say to himself, "It is as if this day I received it from Sinai." No other study is necessary. Greek philosophy, secular science, may be studied only at that hour which is neither day nor night. Every word of the Hebrew Scriptures is literally the Word of God. Even the Song of Songs is a hymn inspired by God, to portray allegorically the union of Yahweh with Israel as his chosen bride. Since without the law there would be moral chaos, the law must have existed before the creation of the world in the bosom or mind of God. Only its communication to Moses was an event in time. The Talmud, so far as it is halakha, is also God's eternal word. It is the formulation of laws orally communicated to Moses by God, and by Moses to his successors, and its decrees are as binding as anything in the Scriptures. Some rabbis rank the Mishnah above the Scriptures in authority, as being a later and revised form of the law. Certain rabbinical edicts frankly voided laws of the Pentateuch or interpreted them into harmlessness. During the Middle Ages, from 476 to 1492, the Jews of Germany and France studied the Talmud far more than the Scriptures. The Talmud, like the Bible, takes for granted the existence of an intelligent and omnipotent God. There were occasional skeptics among the Jews, like the learned Elisha ben Abuya, whom the pious Rabbi Meir befriended. But they were apparently a tiny and hardly vocal minority. The Talmud's God is frankly anthropomorphic. He loves and hates, gets angry, laughs, weeps, feels remorse, wears phylacteries, sits on a throne surrounded by a ministering hierarchy of cherubim and seraphim, and studies the Torah 3 times a day. The rabbis acknowledged that these human attributes were a bit hypothetical. We borrow terms from his creatures to apply to him, they said, in order to assist the understanding. It was not their fault if the commonality could think only in pictures. They also represented God as the soul of the universe, invisible, pervasive, vitalizing, at once transcendent and immanent, above the world and yet present in every nook and fragment of it. This universal divine presence, the Shekinah, or dwelling, is especially real in sacred places, persons, and things, and in moments of study or prayer. Nevertheless, this omnipresent God is one. Of all ideas, the most distasteful to Judaism is that of a plurality of gods. The unity of God is passionately reiterated against the polytheism of the pagans and the apparent tritheism of the Christian Trinity. It is proclaimed in the most famous and universal of Jewish prayers, the Shema Yisrael. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. No Messiah, no prophet, no saint is to have a place beside him in his temple or worship. The rabbis forbade, except on rare occasions, the utterance of his name, hoping to deter profanity and magic. To avoid the sacred tetragrammaton, JHVH, they used the word Adonai, Lord, and recommended even for this such substitutions as the Holy One, the Merciful One, the heavens, and our Father which is in heaven. God can and does work miracles, especially through great rabbis, but these marvels are not to be thought of as infractions of nature's laws. There are no laws but the will of God. Everything created has a divine and beneficent purpose. God created the snail as a cure for the scab, the fly as a cure for the sting of the wasp, and the gnat as a cure for the bite of the serpent, and the serpent as a cure for a sore. Between God and man there is a continuous relation. Every step of man's life is taken in the inescapable sight of God. Every deed or thought of man's day honors or dishonors the divine presence. All men are descended from Adam. Nevertheless, man was first created with a tail like an animal, and up to the generation of Enoch, the faces of the people resembled those of monkeys. Man is composed of body and soul. His soul is from God, his body is of the earth. The soul impels him to virtue, the body to sin. Or perhaps his evil impulses come from Satan and that multitude of malignant spirits which lurks about everywhere. Every evil, however, may be ultimately good. Without his earthly desires, man might neither toil nor breed. Come, says a jolly passage, let us ascribe merit to our ancestors, for if they had not sinned, we should not have come into the world. Sin is natural, but its guilt is not inherited. The rabbis accepted the doctrine of the fall of man, but not of original sin or divine atonement. A man suffers only for his own sins. If he suffers more on earth than his sins seem to warrant, that may be because we do not know the full measure of his sins. Or such excess of punishment may be a great blessing, as entitling the sufferer to exceptional rewards in heaven. Therefore, said Akiva, a man should rejoice in the multitude of his misfortunes. As for death, it came into the world through sin. A really sinless person would never die. Death is a debt owed by a sinful humanity to the author of all life. A midrash tells a touching story of death and Rabbi Meir. While Rabbi Meir was holding his weekly discourse on a Sabbath afternoon, his two beloved sons died suddenly at home. Their mother covered them with a sheet and forbore to mourn on the sacred day. When Rabbi Meir returned after evening services, he asked for his sons, whom he had not seen in the synagogue. She asked him to recite the Havdalah, a ceremony marking the close of the Sabbath, and gave him his evening meal. Then she said, I have a question to ask thee. A friend once gave me jewels to keep for him. Now he wishes them again. Shall I return them? Beyond doubt thou must, said Rabbi Meir. His wife took him by the hand, led him to the bed, and drew back the sheet. Rabbi Meir burst into bitter weeping, and his wife said, They were entrusted to us for a time. Now their master has taken back his very own. The Hebrew Scriptures had said little of an immortality of reward and punishment, but that idea now played a major role in rabbinical theology. Hell was pictured at Gehinnom, or Sheol, and divided like heaven into 7 stories with graduated degrees of torment. Only the most wicked of the circumcised would enter it, and even confirmed sinners would not be punished forever. All who go down to hell shall come up again, except these 3, he who commits adultery, he who shames another in public, and he who gives another a bad name. Heaven was called Gan Eden, and was represented as a garden of every physical and spiritual delight. The wine there would be of a vintage preserved from the 6 days of the creation. Perfumes would bless the air, and God himself would join the saved in a banquet whose supreme joy would be the sight of his face. However, some rabbis confessed that no man can say what lies beyond the grave. The Jews thought of salvation in terms of the nation rather than of the individual. Driven across the earth with apparently irrational ruthlessness, they strengthened themselves with the belief that they were still the chosen and favored people of God. He was their Father and a just God. It could not be that he would break covenant with Israel. Was it not to them that he had given those scriptures which both the Christians and the Moslems accepted and revered? In the depths of their despair they mounted to such compensatory pride that their rabbis, who had exalted them, had to humble them with reproof. Then as now they longed for the land of their nation's birth, and idealized it in loving memory. He who walks 4 ells in Palestine is sure of everlasting life, they said. He who lives in Palestine is without sin. Even the merest talk of those who dwell in Palestine is Torah. The central part of the daily prayers, the Shemona Esrei, or 18 paragraphs, included a petition for the coming of the Son of David, the Messiah King who would make the Jews a nation again, united, free, worshipping God in their own temple with the ancient ritual and song. 2. Ritual. What distinguished the Jews in this age of faith, what kept them one in their scattering, was not theology, but ritual, not a creed that Christianity had merely extended and that Islam would substantially adopt, but a ceremonial law of such burdensome complexity that only this proud and high-strung people showed the humility and patience required to obey it. Christianity sought unity through uniform belief, Judaism through uniform ritual. The laws were given, said Abba Areka, only for the purpose of disciplining and refining men by their observance. The ritual was first of all a law of worship. When the synagogue succeeded the temple, animal sacrifice was replaced by offerings and prayer. But no more in the synagogue than in the temple was any image of God or man allowed. Every approach to idol worship was shunned, and instrumental music, permitted in the temple, was forbidden in the synagogue. Here Christianity diverged, Mohammedanism stemmed from Judaism. The Semites developed a somber piety, the Christians a somber art. Prayer made every day, almost every hour, a religious experience for the Orthodox Jew. Morning prayers were to be said with phylacteries, small cases containing passages from the Scriptures, affixed to the forehead and the arms. No meal was to be eaten without a brief grace before it, and a longer prayer of thanksgiving at its close. But these domestic prayers were not enough. Men can be held together only by doing things together, and the rabbis argued with Oriental hyperbole that a man's prayer is heard by God only when offered in a synagogue. The public liturgy consisted mainly of the Shemona Esrei, the Shema Yisrael, readings from the Pentateuch, the prophets, and the Psalms, a homily of scriptural explanation, the Kaddish, or prayers of praise and blessing for the living and the dead, and a concluding benediction. This remains the essential synagogue ritual to the present day. Far more detailed than these regulations of worship were the rules for cleanliness or ritual purity. Physical hygiene was considered favorable to spiritual health. The rabbis forbade living in a city in which there was no bathhouse, and gave almost medical instructions for the bath. If one bathes with hot water, and does not follow it with cold water, it is like iron which is inserted into a furnace and not afterward plunged into cold water. The body, like the iron, must be tempered and steeled. Anointing should follow the bath. Hands were to be washed immediately upon rising, before and after each meal, and before ceremonial prayer or any other ritual observance. Corpses, sexual functions, menstruation, childbirth, vermin, pigs, and leprosy, that is, various skin diseases, were ritually, that is, by religious law, unclean. Persons touched or affected by any of these were to go to the synagogue and perform a purification ceremonial. A woman was considered unclean, not to be sexually approached, for 40 days after bearing a son, 80 days after bearing a daughter. In accord with the biblical injunction, see Genesis, chapter 17, verses 9 through 14, a boy was to be circumcised on his 8th day. This was represented as a sacrifice to, and a covenant with, Yahweh. But the prevalence of the custom among Egyptians, Ethiopians, Phoenicians, Syrians, and Arabs suggests that it was a hygienic measure indicated in a climate more favorable to sexual precocity and excitability than to cleanliness. And this conclusion is reinforced by the rabbinical command that no Jew should keep beyond 12 months an uncircumcised slave. The Talmud occasionally reads like a manual of home medicine rather than a code of religious laws. It had to be an encyclopedia of advice for its people. The Jews of the 4th and 5th centuries, like most Mediterranean peoples, were slipping back into the medical superstitions and makeshifts of the isolated and the poor. And a good deal of this popular and superstitious medicine entered into the Talmud. Nevertheless, we find in the Babylonian Gemara excellent descriptions of the esophagus, larynx, trachea, lungs, meninges, and genitals. Tumors of the lungs, cirrhosis of the liver, caseous degeneration, and many other diseases are accurately described. The rabbis note that flies in drinking cups may carry infection, and hemophilia is recognized as an hereditary ailment, making circumcision of the offspring inadvisable. Mingled with these ideas are magical formulas for exorcising demons supposed to cause disease. The rabbis, like all of us, were experts on diet. Dietary wisdom begins with the teeth. These should never be extracted, no matter how they ache, for if a man chews well with his teeth, his feet will find strength. Vegetables and fruits, except the date, are highly recommended. Meat is a luxury which only the well-washed should have. The animal is to be killed in such a way as to minimize its pain, and draw the blood out of the meat. To eat flesh with blood is an abomination. Hence the slaughter of animals for food must be left to trained persons, who will also examine the viscera to make sure that the animal is not diseased. Meat and milk and dishes prepared with them must not be eaten at the same meal, or even placed near each other in the kitchen. The flesh of swine is to be abhorred. Eat no eggs, onions, or garlic that have been left overnight without their shell or peel. Eat at stated hours only. Don't peck all day like hens. More people die from overeating than from undernourishment. Up to 40 eating is beneficial. After that age, drinking is beneficial. Moderation in drinking is better than total abstinence. Wine is often a good medicine, and there is no gladness without it. Pursuing the subject of diet to its end, the rabbis argued that he who prolongs his stay in a privy lengthens his years, and recommended a prayer of thanksgiving after every answer to nature's call. They frowned upon asceticism and counseled their people to enjoy the good things of life where no sin was involved. Fasts were obligatory at certain periods and on some holy days, but perhaps here too religion was used as a prod to health. The wisdom of the race bade the Jews keep festival and make feast now and then, despite the overtones of sorrow and longing that sounded even in their joys. On a festival, a man must make glad his wife and household. If possible, he must outfit them with new clothes. The Sabbath, greatest of Jewish inventions, was apparently a burden in Talmudic days. The pious Jew was then expected to speak as little as possible, light no fire in his home, and spend hours at the synagogue and in prayer. A long tractate discussed with head-splitting, hair-splitting, just what might and what might not be done on the Sabbath. But the casuistry of the rabbis was directed to mitigating rather than increasing the terrors of piety. Their subtlety devised convincing reasons for doing what one had to do on the day of rest. Moreover, the good Jew discovered a secret happiness in observing the ancient Sabbath ritual. He began it with a little ceremony of sanctification, or kiddush. Surrounded by his family and his guests, for this was a favorite day for entertaining friends, he took a full cup of wine, pronounced a benediction over it, drank, and passed the cup along for guests and wife and children to drink. Then he took bread and blessed it, thanking the God who bringeth forth bread from the earth, and passed portions of it to all who shared his table. No fasting or mourning was permitted on the Sabbath. Many holy days divided the year and gave new occasions for pious remembrance or grateful rest. Pesach, beginning on the 14th of Nisan, or April, commemorated through 8 days the escape of the Jews from Egypt. In biblical times it had been called the Feast of Unleavened Bread, because the Jews had fled with the dough of their bread still unleavened. Talmudic times called it Pesach, that is, Passover, because Yahweh, smiting the firstborn of the Egyptians, passed over those houses whose doorposts had been sprinkled by the Jewish occupants with the blood of the Lamb. On the first day of the feast the Jews celebrated the Paschal meal, or Seder. Each father acted as leader of the service for his gathered family, performed with them a ritual recalling those bitter Mosaic days, and passed on, by questions and answers, their treasured story to the young. At Pentecost, 7 weeks after Passover, the feast of Shavuot celebrated the wheat harvest and the revelation on Mount Sinai. On the first day of Tishri, the 7th month of the ecclesiastical, the first month of the Jewish civil year, corresponding roughly with the autumnal equinox, the Jews celebrated Rosh Hashanah, the feast of the new year and of the month's new moon, and blew the ram's horn, or shofar, to commemorate the revealing of the Torah, to call men to repentance and to anticipate the happy day when such a blast would summon all the Jews of the world to worship their God in Jerusalem. From the eve of Rosh Hashanah to the 10th day of Tishri were penitential days. On all but the 9th of those days, pious Jews fasted and prayed, and on the 10th, Yom Kippurim, the Day of Atonement, from sunset to sunset, they were not to eat or drink or wear shoes or labor or bathe or indulge in love. All day long they attended services in the synagogue, confessed and mourned their sins and those of their people, even from the worship of the golden calf. On the 15th day of Tishri came Sukkoth, the Feast of Tabernacles. For 7 days the Jews were supposed to live in booths, to commemorate the tents in which it was said their ancestors had slept during their 40 years' sojourn in the wilderness. In the dispersion, a literal fulfillment of this old vintage or harvest festival offered difficulties, and the rabbis showed their goodwill by redefining Sukkah to mean almost anything that could symbolize a habitation. On the 25th of the 9th month, Kislev, or December, and for 7 days thereafter, the feast of Hanukkah, or dedication, recalled the purification of the temple by the Maccabees in 165 B.C., after its defilement by Antiochus Epiphanes. On the 14th of Adar, or March, the Jews celebrated Purim, or Lots, the deliverance of their people from the wiles of the Persian minister Haman by Esther and Mordecai. Gifts and good wishes were exchanged in a joyful and vinous feast. On that day, said Rab Rabbah, a man should drink until he could no longer distinguish between "Cursed be Haman" and "Cursed be Mordecai." We must not think of those Talmudic Jews as dour pessimists, sick with the pangs of despised talents, tossed about by the storms of doctrine and lost in longing for their ravished fatherland. Amid dispersion and oppression, atonement and poverty, they kept their heads erect, relished the tang and strife of life, the brief beauty of their burdened women, and the abiding splendor of earth and sky. Every day, said Rabbi Meir, a man should utter 100 benedictions. And another said, for all of us, to walk even 4 ells without bowing the head is an offense to heaven. For is it not written, the whole earth is full of his glory? 3. Ethics of the Talmud. The Talmud is not only an encyclopedia of Jewish history, theology, ritual, medicine, and folklore. It is also a treatise on agriculture, gardens, industry, the professions, commerce, finance, taxation, property, slavery, inheritance, theft, legal procedure, and penal law. To do the book justice, it would be necessary with polymathic wisdom to survey its judgments in all these fields. The Talmud is above all a code of ethics, so different from the Christian and so like the Moslem that even a running acquaintance with it challenges the view of the Middle Ages as merely the story of medieval Christianity. The 3 religions agreed in rejecting the practicability of a natural or non-religious morality. Most men, they believed, can be persuaded to tolerable behavior only by the fear of God. All 3 based their moral code on identical conceptions: the all-seeing eye and all-recording hand of God, the divine authorship of the moral code, and the ultimate equalization of virtue with happiness by post-mortem punishments and rewards. In the 2 Semitic cultures, law as well as ethics was inseparable from religion. No distinction was admitted between crime and sin, between civil and ecclesiastical law. Every discreditable act is an offense against God, a profanation of his presence and holy name. The 3 religions agreed further on certain elements of morality: the sanctity of the family and the home, the honor due to parents and the old, the loving care of children, and charity to all. No people has surpassed the Jews in the order of beauty of family life. In Judaism, as in Islam, voluntary celibacy or childlessness was a major sin. To make a home and a family was a religious mandate, the first of the 613 precepts of the law. A childless person, says a midrash, is accounted as dead. Jew, Christian, and Moslem agreed that the adequate continuance of the group is endangered when the religious command to parentage loses its force. Under certain circumstances, however, the rabbis permitted family limitation, preferably by contraception. There are 3 classes of women who should employ an absorbent: a minor, lest pregnancy should prove fatal; a pregnant woman, lest abortion should result; and a nursing mother, lest she become pregnant and prematurely wean the child so that it dies. The Jews, like their contemporaries, were reluctant to have daughters, but rejoiced at the birth of a son. He, not she, could carry on the father's name, family, and property, and tend his grave. The daughter would marry into another, perhaps a distant household, and be lost to her parents as soon as her rearing was complete. But once children came, They were cherished without favoritism, and with a wise mixture of discipline and love. "If thou must strike a child," said one rabbi, "do it with a shoestring. If one refrains from punishing a child," says another, "it will end by becoming utterly depraved." Every sacrifice must be made to give the child an education, that is, to instruct the mind and train the character by a knowledge of the law and the prophets. "The world is saved," said a Hebrew proverb, "by the breath of school children." The Shekinah, or divine presence, shines in their faces. The child, in turn, must honor and protect the parents under all conditions to the end. Charity was an inescapable obligation. Greater is he who practices charity than he who performs all the sacrifices. Some Jews were niggardly, some were miserly, but by and large no other people has ever given as generously as the Jews. The rabbis had to forbid men to give more than a fifth of their property to charity, yet some were found at their death to have given half. On Abba Umna's face there was always a holy peace. He was a surgeon, but would never accept with his hands any payment for his service. He had a box placed in the corner of his consulting room, so that those who were able to pay could deposit what they wished, and those who could not afford to pay would not be shamed. Rav Huna, when he sat down to a meal, would open the doors and exclaim, "Let whoever is in need enter and eat." Chama ben Eli gave bread to all who sought it, and kept his hand in his purse when he walked abroad, so that none need hesitate to ask. But the Talmud reproved conspicuous giving and counseled a modest secrecy. He who dispenses charity in private is greater than Moses. To the institution of marriage the rabbis addressed all their learning and eloquence. On it and religion rested the whole structure of Jewish life. They did not condemn the sexual appetite, but they feared its force and labored to control it. Some advised that salt be eaten with bread to lessen the seminal fluid. Others felt that the only recourse against sexual temptation was hard work combined with the study of the Torah. If this availed not, let him go to a place where he is unknown, put on black clothes, and do what his heart desires, but let him not publicly profane the name. A man should avoid any situation that may excite his passions. He should not talk much with women, and he should never walk behind a woman along the road, not even his own wife. A man should walk behind a lion rather than behind a woman. The delightful humor of the rabbis appears again in the story of Reb Kahan. He was once selling ladies' baskets when he was exposed to temptation. He pleaded with his tempter to let him off and promised to return. But instead of returning, he went up to the roof of a house and threw himself down. Before he reached the ground, Elijah came and caught him and reproached him with having brought him a distance of 400 miles to save him from self-destruction. The rabbis apparently felt that virginity is all right in its place, but that perpetual virginity is arrested development. In their view, the supreme perfection of a woman is perfect motherhood, as the supreme virtue of man is perfect fatherhood. Every father was urged to save and provide a dowry for each of his daughters, and a marriage settlement for each son, lest their marriage be unhealthily delayed. Early marriage was recommended, at 14 for the girl, 18 for the man. A girl might legally marry at 12 years and 6 months, a man at 13. Postponement of marriage was permitted to students engaged in the study of the law. Some rabbis argued that a man should get his economic footing before marrying. A man should first build a house, then plant a vineyard, then marry. But this was a minority opinion, and perhaps involved no contradiction if the parents provided the expected financial aid. The youth was advised to choose his mate not for her beauty, but for her prospective qualities as a mother. Descend a step in choosing a wife, ascend a step in choosing a friend. To marry a woman above one's rank is to invite contumely. The Talmud, like the Old Testament and the Koran, allowed polygamy. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.